Good morning. It's another episode of Marijuana Channel 1. I am here with Anne van Leynseele, one of the early cannabis attorneys here in the state of Washington, and really nationally, who has just penned a book called Cultivating Crime that is set to release. So I'm here to welcome an old friend and an influencer in the industry. Welcome, Anne.
Good morning, Dave.
So it's been a while since we've spoken. Let's talk about the early days. I met you back in, I guess, 2012 or 2013, back in the early days of Washington State. 10 years later, here we are.
Yeah, I think back to those early days. You were, of course, and MJBA were a critical part of my decision to jump into cannabis law. And we became allies very quickly and developed a program where we were educating early licensees in the state of Washington. It was called the MJBA Boot Camp, remember?
I remember them well. Yeah, in the early days, the MJBA was really a forum because voter initiatives had changed the law, and government and business infrastructure, banking, certainly, the legal, infrastructure and establishment was geared geared towards helping young entrepreneurs try to establish themselves as legal cannabis businesses. How did you, first of all, you started off in entertainment and then moved into healthcare. How did you wind up in legal cannabis in the first place, Anne?
Well, I saw a small article in Time magazine after I left Washington, D.C. and came back to Washington State. And this article pointed out that the Federal Bureau of Reclamation was denying water rights to legal cannabis growers in Colorado and Washington State. It really bothered me. I felt that was federalism run amok. Washington and Colorado were forging ahead in breaking ground in a very difficult terrain of legalizing on a state level, while marijuana was still considered Schedule I drug at a federal level. And this is an experiment that has been very important in the legalization of cannabis.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in the early days, I mean, I mentioned you as an early cannabis attorney, there really wasn't such a thing, right? They don't teach cannabis law in law school, do they?
Well, they do now, but back then it was a very frightening risk to take. I came back and started to develop a solo practice in healthcare law because of the federal changes with the Affordable Care Act. And a lot of the smaller medical practices were either selling off to a larger entity or weren't interested in compliance. So you asked how I wound up in cannabis law. It's a very similar regulatory practice, which is my forefront. I work in the regulatory area. And, at the time, I didn't envision where I would be right now in sort of being a regulatory enforcement lawyer. I'm reaching out with this book and really saying we're heading into a 10-year anniversary. And I think it's critical as we look forward to the federal legalization, that we learn from what has happened in the last 10 years, things that are working, things that are not working, how we can use the lessons learned in Washington State on a national level to benefit the states that are just coming online.
So you referenced the book, so that's really why we're talking today. Cultivating Crime, fascinating. I got an advanced look, which I've been poring over. It's a wild tale. It kind of, reads on three different levels. There's the story of the industry, which is evolving from, the illegal and medical / gray market into the fully regulated state markets that you're referencing today. And then there's the personal tale, Anne's tale, and, being a woman attorney, making your place and then making your place within this industry. And then there's a what I would call a cautionary tale, if you will, about partnership. And it's a very kind of a rough ride, talking about how you built your practice, and then in order to scale, you partnered, and how that partnership turned south. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, thank you for your astute observation. I agree with your analysis, and I'm just going to take those topics 1, 2, 3. The why behind the story of the industry, and to explain a little without being a spoiler. The interesting thing about an attorney is we're precluded from sharing a lot of information about our clients and their situations. So I had to navigate a minefield of over cautious storytelling, and yet I wanted to fairly portray what was happening. So I took this tact of dealing with hypotheticals and other attorney experiences, interwoven with teaching the reader about how difficult it was at that time for newly formed cannabis licensed entities or companies to figure out what was going on. The agency that a lot of people had negative things to say about, but I was always a big advocate of, is the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. They were working in a very difficult situation, defining how they would regulate this newly formed and newly legalized recreational cannabis industry. So the story takes some twists and turns on and tries to underscore that we were adapting, we were accommodating, we were giving feedback to the, my law firm was giving feedback directly to the Liquor and Cannabis Board about, this isn't working, or you need to change this, or this isn't clear. Help us understand how this applies. The second layer that you referred to is my personal experiences in this industry. I came into it kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, full of optimism about everybody wanting to comply. And I know, Dave, that there were times I spoke of this so often that you kind of took a little nap as I was speaking. What I found was that the industry sorted it out into a third, and a third. 1/3 were enthusiastically embracing this new American dream opportunity and wanted to be fully compliant. The middle third were people that were coming out of the medical industry or out of the black market that wanted to comply and were trying to understand all the new rules and restrictions and paying taxes and keeping business records. And then there was what I referred to as the bottom third. And that bottom third still exists and dovetails into the third category that you spoke of, which is the cautionary tale. And really my warning and my hands up approach saying, look, regulators, lawmakers, enforcement agencies, you need to be aware. And that is where my personal story goes into so much detail to make these regulatory agencies take a hard look at how easy it is for unchecked criminality to exist in a legal environment. And I want this new this next 10 years in the cannabis industry to pay closer attention to tighter reins on that area of keeping that bottom third out, getting rid of it, and some course corrections.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Over the past 10 years, do you think that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 mix has changed? I mean, we've seen the influx of international money, Canadian public dollars, big CPG, big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma, right? Everybody is playing in this cannabis space. So does the mainstreaming of marijuana necessarily mean that adherence to regulations becomes more compliant?
Well, it's interesting. You're talking about the more big picture, greater opportunity and greater flexibility. What I would argue that rather, I mean, one of them, Prime, speaks to exactly what you asked, which is allowing out-of-state investors in. And I think that it's critical that we look at some greater financial controls before we allow out-of-state investors into Washington state.
Greater financial controls than even we have today?
Well, you know, I think that the problem is the illusion of financial controls that are happening right now. You know, I studied economics in undergrad, and there are some principles at play in the cannabis industry that are sort of tamping down the free market economy course corrections that would normally happen. I mean, the marijuana industry must be beyond reproach. It is an industry that has taken an illegal activity in the United States and tried to convert it to a legal activity. That's a pretty high lift.
Well, but so did alcohol, right? You know, so did many pharmaceuticals, and now psilocybin. There are lots of industries that used to be illegal that are now legal. There's nothing especially dangerous about growing cannabis, is there? I mean, why do we need such strict regulations? It was only criminal because it was illegal. It wasn't criminal because it was dangerous.
Well, I think that there are some important state and federal level regulatory controls that need to be refined, Dave. I think we're doing a fine job. And certainly in the first 10 years, it has been incredible what has been accomplished so far. But as we look at federal descheduling, there are three critical things that need to happen to support a more stabilized and sustainable industry, which is what you and I were talking about in the very first days and first years of cannabis in Washington state. So there's the descheduling, the banking regulation, and federal banks being able to work in this space is critical. And then a testing and safety standard protocol. That's where I think the federal involvement should begin and end.
So let's just stop there, because you made two really good points I want you to elaborate on. So the first is banking, and there is the Safe Banking Act, which has been introduced and has bipartisan support, and pretty much has just been paused by leader Chuck Schumer, because he wants to then incorporate the MORE Act, which addresses the criminal justice reform. So Cory Booker is saying, hey, banking is great for those moneyed class, but let's also make sure, as we're legalizing, to address exactly what I was saying before, the criminality and the harsh penalties which linger on people who were incarcerated because of marijuana activity. So they want to link those two. So that's happening. But the second one, standards, I don't see much. I mean, everybody's talking about it, but I don't see much industry support for common standards on testing or labeling or, you know, other protocols.
Sure. And I'm going to go back to, I agree with you. And I think the descheduling point that we both first made is where Schumer's bill really cuts to the heart of. It's great to just talk about descheduling, but we need to define how that trickles down. So I think they've got that covered. It's an interesting bill. The Banking Act bill is the Safe Banking Act is the second point that you and I are both making. And then the third point that I raise is a federal level minimum standards as guidelines to the states on how they control testing and safety standards. So what we're talking about is that the Cole memo is sort of obsolete and needs a renovation. And I think that that can come from federal level controls on those three issues we just addressed. I often have talked about, I see federal legalization or decriminalization of marijuana being similar to DOMA or the Same-Sex Marriage Act, that a president will stand in the Rose Garden and say, you know, we now recognize cannabis as legally, federally no longer a criminal act, and it is now off the Controlled Substance Act, but we leave it to the states to regulate how it will be managed and how it will be regulated.
Let's talk about the banking, right? Is that when you come to financial technologies, you know, these commercial platforms, they need a federal or indeed a global network in order to scale. Right, you have to have participation. You can't have fragmented markets, and you know, the rails can't run at different gauges in every state and expect to have any kind of efficient marketplace. So, you know, I think that the notion of standards is kind of commonly agreed upon. The rubber hits the road when it comes to what level of regulation. Are we going to create a medical standards, right? Pharmaceutical standards, which have economic implications. Are we having food standards? Are we having, you know, best manufacturing standards?
I think that there are 5 key things that need to be covered at every state level that, again, will have the overarching federal controls. But the states need regulation and enforcement. We need a new basic level for states' regulatory schemes. We need a restriction on access for minors. We need to control the black market, and we need to follow the money. We need to make you know, here's one initiative that I think would accomplish what you and I talked about in controlling and getting rid of the bottom third. You know, here's one example of an idea, a mandatory third-party audit reporting, which is common practice in both nonprofits and publicly traded corporations. By simply doing this, marijuana companies can disclose a third-party audit of their financial status. It does a lot of things to build public trust. It better understands where they are non-compliant and compliant. It makes them more attractive investment opportunities as well. The state of Washington could offer a tax relief incentive for any company that voluntarily provides these audited financial reports. But again, where we run into problems with black market and illegal activities is always in the financial.
Right. So what are the lessons that the Washington, you're talking a lot about the LCB, as we call it out here. And, you know, the LCB is moving away from its leaf system, the MJ freeway traceability system that many of the states have had, right? We've had metric in many states, or BioTrack or Leaf. These are sort of the big 3 state systems. And then the individual licensees had to keep their books on another traceability or POS system. And those systems spoke to each other through APIs. The state of Washington is saying, we're getting out of the software business. you've got to now manage your own traceability in whatever protocols and just send us the reports, CSV files or Excel sheets, if you will. So it's moving towards more of an IRS kind of reporting structure. The IRS, I guess, uses audits in order to enforce its compliance, and the IRS is not tracking every one of your transactions. So is that the direction that you're talking about?
Washington State did an incredible thing in that they publish monthly sales reports. And those dollar figure sales reports are used by financial institutions within Washington State to compare the cash flow that is going into banks and credit unions in Washington State. This is an incredible tool for making sure that black market money isn't flowing through licensed entity bank accounts. This simple monitoring tool that Washington State has so successfully employed was an eye-opening experience for both European regulators and national various states that I've spoken to and shared this very sophisticated implementation that Washington State does. It's not done in other states in the country, and it's not done in a lot of European countries. So I think that, again, this is a very specific point that we can learn from what Washington State did well and implement in other states in the United States. I loop back to following the money trail because, again, I stated that you know, an audited financial status report following GAA, which is generally AAP, which is generally accepted accounting principles. Those sorts of audits are very inexpensive, and I think there are a lot of benefits, including public credibility, marijuana lenders having a greater appeal. You know, this ties into the, as you said, the LCB is letting go of this minutia tracking of financial transactions. And so again, it really speaks to needing to fill that void of how are we now tracking what the source of funds is. Where is the money coming from? Because a lot of the abuse is coming from black market sales where the money is flowing into a licensed entity.
So, Anne, let's get back to the book. You have so much, we could go on and on forever, but I want to bring it back to the book, and we're, you know, kind of reaching the end of our first conversation here. So who do you hope reads this book, and what are the lessons that we'll come away with after we read Cultivating Crime?
Well, I took what was a very difficult and traumatic experience. My law partner actually stole from our company for the entire 2 years that we were business partners, and then sort of lied to cover up, and I fraudulently obtained a release from all of those criminal activities. He never denied that he did everything. He just sort of said, well, you know, that doesn't count anymore, and he moved on. This was a difficult experience to go through. It was very eye-opening. And it was made even worse, Dave, by my experience with the lack of the Washington State Bar Association and the lack of the Washington State prosecutors actually holding him accountable for his activities.
Well, this is a tell-all book that's going to appeal to anyone in the Washington State legal cannabis industry. We're a pretty small community, so we'll all recognize these personalities, and while you use first names in a lot of cases, so it'll have a local appeal here in Washington State. How about outside that? Are there lessons here for other? There's a lot of emerging legal cannabis states coming online: Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, just to name three. Are there lessons for those folks? And then how about folks who aren't in legal cannabis?
Well, thank you. You queued that question up nicely for me, Dave. The interesting thing is I told this this is a true life legal thriller. This is actually something that will appeal to lawyers. Gresham recently was interviewed, and he said he can always tell when a legal book, a legal thriller or novel is written by a non-lawyer. And I've tied in a lot of the elements there of a legal thriller, because that's actually what happened to me. This was a terrifying experience from start to finish. In the 3 years that this was all uncovering and revealing itself, and the story began to happen. Lawyers will enjoy this. People across the board, and cannabis enthusiasts, people that aren't in the cannabis industry, will be intrigued by this. Is a first time ever look behind the scenes of legal cannabis in the United States. For my little review, I kind of call it the insider's look at the underbelly of legal cannabis. Yeah, well, the subtitle of the book is The Dark Side of Legal Marijuana. This is a peek at all the things that the press and regulators and government agencies and law enforcement and judiciary do not want you to know. Okay, so you've teased us enough. When does the book come out? Where can I get it? Where do I go? On November 16th, I am self-publishing on Amazon. It will be available. It's exciting. I rushed to get this. I thought about this for a long time, and finding a bigger meaning to the small story that happened to me. And I rushed to publish this. It's not perfection, but it's a really gripping story. I've had people read this in 6 hours flat. Fantastic. The book is called Cultivating Crime. The author is Anne van Leynseele. November the 16th on Amazon. Thank you very much for coming to Marijuana Channel 1. My pleasure, Dave. And I look forward to our next installation. Cheers.